Welcome. For the last year, I've been working on a project to research and transcribe the Southern Claims Commission case files for Liberty County, Georgia, as an addition to my website, theyhadnames.net, which documents the names of African Americans enslaved and free in early records of Liberty County. When I started doing this, I took the testimonies in the documents at face value. But the more documents we completed, the more I began to see it as a process involving greedy lawyers, a commission that struggled to understand the lives of formerly enslaved people on the Georgia coast, where things were different than they were on inland plantations, and formerly enslaved claimants who were trying to navigate a system that was stacked against them from the start. I realized that who they were telling the stories to were very important and could affect the testimony itself. And this started to change my research. Taking a community-focused approach to this project and investigating the process, the personalities behind it, and the environment of the time has provided so much more information than just looking at it one case at a time. In fact, looking at one of these case files for your ancestors on its own without context is likely to give a very misleading impression. Let me set the stage. When Sherman's army reached Savannah at the end of 1864, following their march from Atlanta, they were hungry and tired, and their horses and other stock animals were giving out. The Army naturally turned to Liberty County, which is a little to the southwest of Savannah, and it was a wealthy farming community prior to the war, where now most of the white planters and slaveholders had fled. You can see here a present-day map showing the location of Liberty County in relation to Savannah. The white families had refugeed many of their enslaved people to other locations, but others remained on the mostly deserted plantations right in the path of an unsympathetic and hungry army. The Southern Claims Commission testimonies paint vivid pictures of the encounters between the foraging soldiers and the enslaved population. Enslaved people in Liberty County considered themselves freed once the U.S. soldiers showed up and told them they were free. The Army stripped the county of everything there was to eat and any animal that could provide transportation, leaving the remaining white planter families in a state of helpless rage and fear. The now freed people, as you can imagine, had a very different reaction. After the first shock and fear, many of the African-American claimants described going to the soldiers' camp to cook or do laundry for them. It was December, and one testified that it was cold and that he felt that the soldiers needed such things as blankets and quilts. Many of the African-American claimants freely gave the hungry soldiers what little food they had. Although there was little testimony about personal interactions between them and the soldiers, the testimonies were very clear that the African-American claimants were overjoyed to see them as soon as the soldiers told them they were free. While disappointed at the loss of their property, Jack Walker said he cried like a child when he saw all his things taken, and he personally complained to the colonel in charge, which did no good. John Bacon's reaction was more usual. I had rather have my freedom than any horse. Glory be to God. After the Civil War, the U.S. government began to consider what it owed Southerners who had had property confiscated by the U.S. Army. The Southern Claims Commission was created by an act of Congress on March 3, 1871, to determine whether the applicant had been loyal to the Union, which was a requirement for compensation, and how much should be awarded in compensation. Claims were either allowed, disallowed, or barred, meaning that the applicant was not eligible for the program in the first place. Overall, there were more than 22,000 claims across the South, and only 32% of them were approved. Liberty County had a relatively high claim rate compared to other Southern counties, most likely because of that raid by Sherman's army, and an even higher approval rate. Most of the petitioners were African Americans, and they had a higher rate of success, mostly because the white petitioners had a lot of difficulty in proving their loyalty to the Union. After all, even if a white resident had such sympathies during the Civil War, it was not wise or safe to express them, so it was very difficult to prove. The Southern Claims Commission was troubled by how many claims came out of Liberty County. As we'll discuss later, many of the claims appeared suspiciously similar and they thought exaggerated. We'll discuss why that was, how much of it might actually have been true, and how much of it we can attribute to the racism of the parties involved. The claims commissioners struggled in particular throughout the program with whether or not slaves could be considered to have owned property. In a convoluted piece of logic, they sometimes reasoned that any property, especially food, that was owned by an enslaved person would have had to have been supplied by the slave owner anyway, and thus it was not only really the property of the slave owner, but it actually aided the Confederate effort. One of the lawyers had a dry but successful response to say that this property belonged to the master and therefore it should not be paid for does not look very well from the high moral anti-slavery standpoint. The commission came to accept that enslaved people in Liberty County had owned property, and in fact, this property was often used to supplement what was provided and as luxuries. I mentioned that I have a website called They Had Names, where I post abstracts and transcripts of documents naming African Americans in early Liberty County records. The site has so far posted more than 60 full transcripts of the Liberty County Southern Claims Commission case files, and I have posted research on more than 40 of the claimants, tracing their lives back into slavery and forward into freedom. Kathy Dillon, a wonderful person who has done many transcripts for the site as a volunteer, transcribed many of these claims. The case files, which can be found online at Ancestry and Fold 3, where they're indexed both by the claimants and the witnesses, generally include all the papers that were in the original file, including the original application, any amended applications, testimony by the claimant and his or her witnesses, a list of the property taken and its values, the commission's verdict, a special agent report if there was one, and if the claim was successful, the paperwork for generating the award money. There were several versions of the questions that were to be asked of the claimants and witnesses. So if you're looking at one of these, you'll want to look at the date of the testimony to determine which set of questions was in use at that time. Without the questions, it's hard to make sense of the answers, or the answers could be misunderstood. You can find the different versions of the questions on the St. Louis County Library website, and the link is in the handout. Many of the questions were designed to tease out whether the claimant could have been considered to be loyal, to have been loyal to the United States during the rebellion. And African American claimants did not have to answer most of those questions because their loyalty and desire for the Union to succeed was assumed. Some of you may be wondering why enslaved people had property to take. The property taken by the soldiers from the enslaved people consisted mostly of cows and hogs, rice, corn, and potatoes, sometimes honey, and occasionally a horse and buggy. In Liberty County, most slave owners used the task system, in which an enslaved field hand would be assigned a certain amount of work, and if he or she finished that work before the end of the day, the rest of the day could be used to raise stock, plant crops on unused land, etc. Often the arrangement was that the enslaved person would sell the produce or meat to the slave owner or on the market. This practice had multiple advantages for the slave owner, including tying the enslaved person to the land to discourage running away. For a more detailed discussion of the background to this practice in Liberty County, I've linked in the handout to some excellent articles on the subject. Drivers were enslaved people who were assigned to a supervisor position on the plantation. They had particular opportunities to obtain property and were overrepresented in the Southern Claims Commission petitions compared to others. The Southern Claims Commissioners originally misunderstood these opportunities and concluded that a supervisor who did not work the fields himself would not have the chance to own property. In fact, it was just the opposite. There were many testimonies that the drivers were able to have other enslaved people tend to their property and that they received special privileges, which accounts for why they're overrepresented in the claims for confiscated property. When Kathy and I started transcribing the case files for Liberty County, I really just paid attention to the testimony. I think most people do. And I took it and the comments by the commissioners at face value. The more we did, though, and the more I researched the claimants, the more I realized how institutional and personal racism permeated the process. There was also the garden variety corruption that you find in any government process where money is involved. And when I say I took the commissioner's comments at face value, I mean that when they talked about exaggerated claims or claims they thought might have been falsified, I thought it might have been the claimants who did it. I mean, why wouldn't they? They were certainly owed the money. It turns out that wasn't at all the case. Let's start with the lawyers. Reverend James M. Sims of Savannah was probably the first lawyer to have contact with the Liberty County freed people to help them apply for the Southern Claims Commission program. On September 14, 1872, he brought together the first African-American applicants to write their applications, which required them to declare their loyalty to the United States, not a problem, enumerate the property they had lost to the soldiers, and declare the names of their witnesses, both as to loyalty and to ownership of the property. The loyalty part was mostly just a formality. Of course, the commission assumed that formerly enslaved people had wanted the Union to endure. Remember that Reverend Sims was able to read and write, according to this little biography of him, and almost all the Liberty County African-American claimants were illiterate. This would become a point of dispute. Many of the applications he wrote were believed to have exaggerated the amounts of values of confiscated property. And in fact, many of the claimants said in their testimony that what he wrote down for them when it was read back to them was not what they originally told him. There's no doubt in my mind that he thought he was helping. I can't imagine that there was any other motive for him. But it did end up hurting some of the claimants who had their claims denied because of it. So my unexpected connection to that day on September 14th, 1872, I am the descendant of Liberty County slave owners. That was my primary motivation in starting the They Had Names website as a form of reparations. My second great-grandfather, Joseph Ashmore, was the Liberty County probate judge from 1876 to 1889. So I'm used to seeing my maiden name in Liberty County court records, but I wasn't expecting to see it in the Southern Claims Commission records. When James Sims brought together those claimants on September 14, 1872, they must have used the same pen for all the applications they wrote down, which makes perfect sense. And it wasn't a good pen, and those documents have faded much more than many of the other documents in the case files. So it took a while before I saw it. Joseph Ashmore and his nephew, John S. Ashmore, were the witnesses for all the applications made that day. That means they were witnesses to the scene that day. I mean, how I would love to find an account of that. I don't expect I ever will, but it would be amazing. This is their signatures on Titus Alvin's application. This is one of the good copies and the one where I finally realized that their names were there. Raymond K. Jr., the son of Raymond K. Sr., a land and slave owner of Liberty County, was one of the lawyers most frequently seen in these cases. Raymond K. Jr. took on a number of the Southern Claims Commission petitions by freed people, but was eventually barred from receiving awards on their behalf by the Claims Commission, which in 1877 called his abuse of his clients the most flagrant case they had seen. Kay protested that his terms, under which he took half the award, plus double the special commissioner's fee, plus other fees, was fair because he was the only white lawyer who would take on these clients. He said that James Sims and W.H. Sykes, who were both African-American lawyers from Savannah, wouldn't advance their own money to pay the fees. When you submitted the application, you had to pay the fees. Well, he left out, of course, that he was in a different financial situation than they were. The Treasury Department rejected his explanations and assigned the task of delivering the award money to James Atkins, the Savannah Port Customs collector, who traveled to Liberty County and did it in person. Then we have the special commissioners who were appointed by the commission to take testimony in cases where the claimants couldn't travel to Washington to be heard before the commission itself, as was the case for most of the very poor Liberty County claimants. For those Liberty County claims, the change in special commissioners over time was highly significant. There was only one at a time. The first one was Virgil Hillier. He moved from the north to Camden County, Georgia after the Civil War. He was called a carpetbagger in the newspapers. He was elected to the Georgia State Legislature from Camden County, but lost his seat in 1871. Why does his history matter for these Liberty County claims? Because when he took the testimony of these formerly enslaved claimants, they were speaking to a Northerner who, despite having probably all of the prejudices of his time, could be assumed to be sympathetic to them. How can I assume he might have been sympathetic, leaving aside the obvious fact of his being a Northerner? When reading the testimonies taken by Hillier, I had wondered whether or not he wrote them down himself. They're vivid, detailed, and appear to be couched in the claimant's own words. I started noticing that an E.E. Adlington was acting as a witness. It's a surname I don't recognize from Liberty County. Well, it turned out that E.E. Adlington was Ellen Adlington, a school teacher from Massachusetts who came to teach in the Freedmen schools. She lived in Hillier's household, I believe it was she who took down these testimonies, and that between the two of them, the schoolmarm and the northern carpetbagger, I think the freedmen felt more comfortable in speaking their truths in their testimony. These testimonies are where the testimony critical of the slave owners comes from, even though most of the claimants blame other slave owners, not their own. Remember that no matter who was taking down the testimony, it was likely that the lawyer in the room was Raymond K. Jr., the son of a slave owner and well-connected in the county, who was likely to repeat anything that was said. So people had to be careful. It's amazing how free they actually were in speaking. Hillier can't be free from criticism as well. When the commission accused Raymond K. Jr. of charging double the special commissioner's fee, and said that if that were true, then the special commissioner was also unreasonably enriching himself, it was Hillier they were talking about. Henry Way, the next special commissioner, was a very different person. For one thing, he was a Liberty County native and a former slave owner. He had extensive family connections in Liberty County, and he was the clerk of the Liberty County Superior Court, which I think is the reason he was the special commissioner, because his successor also held that position. We can imagine it was a very different thing as a formerly enslaved person to testify in front of Henry Way than it was in front of Virgil Hillier. In fact, one of the early claimants, while Virgil Hillier had been special commissioner, had been held in slavery by Henry Way. Prince Stevens testified in 1873 that he had had nothing to do with Way, his former slave owner, since December 1864. He added that Way had 5 or 6 enslaved people who were 2 families, which was very helpful in the research. The image on this slide shows Prince Stevens being used as collateral on a promissory note by Henry Way to Joseph R. Bacon in 1855 and 1857. Is it likely that formerly enslaved people would speak freely in front of him? The testimony taken by Virgil Hillier sounded like natural speech and was descriptive. You almost felt like you were there at the scene. You can see the one piece of testimony on the left. The testimony taken by Henry Way, here's an example on the right, sounds robotic and was clearly just notes taken down by somebody, probably Robert Q. Castles, who had a store at the railway stop and who acted as the claimant's counsel under Henry Way. So imagine that very different scene in front of former slave owner Henry Way and white merchant Robert Q. Castles and whoever else might be shopping in the store that day. You would imagine the testimony would sound very different. The Southern Claims Commission noticed the difference, and it made frequent complaints about the lack of detail in the testimony taken by Way. They were obviously suspicious of Robert Q. Castles as well, whom they described as an attorney, but who probably was not. After reading all the claims that Way and Castles did, I'm also suspicious that some of them were just made up. The claimants are probably real, but I don't know about the details. There were also 2 special agents seen so far in the Southern claims process for Liberty County, R.B. Avery and W.W. Payne. They lived outside the area and would be sent in whenever the commission had doubts about a case and needed more information before making a decision. The special agent report for each case, if there is one, is included in the case file. The reports reveal very obvious bias on the part of the commission for white witnesses. Claims in which only formerly enslaved people were witnesses, and especially if their testimony was taken by Henry Way and Robert Q. Castles, so there was very little detail, those claims were likely to be rejected out of hand. If there seemed some doubt, the special agent would be sent. He would interview Liberty County residents as to the character of the claimant and whether they knew whether that person had owned property before the war. And if he could, he would even visit the claimant's homes. The special agent's reports make for fascinating reading, but the bias is very obvious. The commission constantly struggled as well with how to value the property that was confiscated from formerly enslaved claimants. It was considered, and in their eyes confirmed by former slave owners, that the property owned by enslaved people was inferior in quality to that owned by whites, especially when it came to horses and buggies. The special agent finally came up with this list that was used in making the monetary awards, although of course it didn't have any relationship at all to the property actually owned by any one individual. When George Powell submitted his claim in 1878, the special commissioner was Henry Way, who took this very sparse and suspiciously similar sounding testimony from claimants. A number of the claims processed by Henry Way were denied on the grounds that the claimants provided no detail about how they obtained the property. Powell's claim was no different. He didn't provide any details at all. So why was his claim approved when others weren't? His white former slave owner testified for him. In other such cases, the former slave owner was dead or had left the county or just wouldn't testify, and those claims were mostly denied. So more than a decade after the Civil War ended, Powell still needed the testimony of his former slave owner, a man who might be hostile, dead, or absent, to win his case, even though it was well documented that enslaved people in Liberty County had owned property and that this property had been taken by U.S. soldiers for Army use during the raid on Liberty County. Powell received $86 of his $220 claim. The Southern Claims Commission, as I've said, was much more likely to approve a claim if the formerly enslaved claimant had at least one white witness, preferably a former slave owner, who would say that he knew the claimant owned property. So the lawyers were aware of this, and they enlisted the services of several young white witnesses, the children of slave owners, who would swear that they knew the claimant had owned property. The commission would sometimes accept this, and sometimes it would point out that the witness would have been a child during the Civil War. The special agent, when he went to the county, he would make it a point to seek out prominent white men and to get their opinions about the claimants, and a lot of weight was put on their word as to the character of the claimant, meaning whether he was likely really to have owned property, and to the value of the property. It was very common for even an approved claim to have the amount significantly downgraded because a white witness cast doubt on the value of enslaved people's property. So the common reasons for denying a claim: the testimony was so weak as to not overcome the presumption that the property belonged to the master and not the slave. We've discussed this misconception that the enslaved people couldn't own property, and also the feeling that, well, if they did, it was really the master's property. Belief that whatever property they did have was so meager that it must have been stolen by the soldiers for their own use because it couldn't have been of use to the army. No white witnesses. Samuel Osgood's claim would have been denied, but his former slave owner just happened to be visiting from Thomas County, and the special agent was able to speak to him, so the claim was approved. The age of the claimant, if they were believed to have been too young before the Civil War to have owned property. And ownership of the property not proven, which was a common cause of being rejected. And again, often due to Henry Way's testimony that had so few details as to be unbelievable. At the end of the Civil War, Prince Stevens was an enslaved man in his 30s who couldn't read or write. By the time he died in 1908, he owned more than 500 acres of land. What else happened in the post-war lives of these claimants? Gus Williams bought land in 1871 and was able to gift a part of it to his nephew in 1896. He kept it that long. Amanda Brown, a formerly enslaved woman, bought a quarter-acre tract of land in her own name in 1894. Jack Wallace and Boson Baggs all changed their surnames in 1872 from their last enslaver's name to the names they chose, which were Walker, Johnson, and Johnson. George Powell bought 72 acres of land and kept it the rest of his life. These men bought 400 acres via a mortgage in 1870 and had paid it off by 1871. In 1885, they divided it up into 42-acre parcels and sold it to each other. George McConnell bought 560 acres of land in 1875. Augustus Williams, one of the trustees of the African Methodist Society, bought land from the White Flemington Church in 1876. In 1895, Isaiah Simpson sued the Florida Central Railroad. He lost, but he sued them. In 1892, though, Ben Howard, a witness for several of the claims, was lynched by two white men who were never brought to trial. And there are many other stories from this resilient community that are not mine to tell, both stories of endurance and overcoming, and also tragic stories. Jack Wilson's story is one that illustrates the usefulness of the Southern Claims Commission files for genealogical research. He testified in 1873 that he had been held in slavery on George W. Walter's Tar's Westfield plantation. He said that he was currently living on land belonging to John L. Hardin and renting it from him for $20 annually. In the 1870 census, he is seen with his wife Dinah as a farm laborer. But by 1875, he had bought land, and in another unexpected connection, he bought it from my second great-grandfather, Joseph Ashmore. By the 1910 census, he and wife Diana had been married for 48 years and had had 11 children, 9 of them living. And then one day while I was searching through the cemetery of the First African Baptist Church in Riceboro, the oldest African-American church in Liberty County, I found his tombstone. It's the only tombstone I've found so far of an SCC claimant. Unfortunately, in 1929, his son Jack died of a gunshot wound, but the death certificate said that that Jack Wilson's wife, her maiden name was LeCount. Joseph L. Hardin, from whom they were renting the land, had married into the LeCount family, so that's most likely why they were living on that land. Researching the slave owners is a very useful thing to do, unfortunately, to determine the lines of inheritance. Aberdeen LeCount, or LeCount, filed a Southern Claims Commission petition naming his last enslaver as William LeCount. Aberdeen showed up in William LeCount's 1841 estate inventory. And in these estate inventories, I've often found that people are listed in what appears to be family order, even though it doesn't say so. Here you see Prince valued at $500 and Suki valued at $400. And then what appear to be their children based on, I'm sorry to put it this way, but the declining value, which probably indicates their age. So children Charity, Aberdeen, Katie, and Bristol. And then it looks like it starts over with a new family with Hamlet, $500. Well, in William LeCount's father, Louis LeCount's 1838 estate inventory, you see the same people listed in the same order, though it looks like Bristol was probably born between 1838 and 1841. And in the 1870 census, we see Prince and Suki LeCount living together, even though relationships aren't specified in the 1870, apparently man and wife. So these, the relationships stated in the case files can lead us backwards in time to find their lives during slavery as well. Useful questions to ask yourself while you're reading one of these claims are: where was the claimant living? The application will give where they were living during the time that their property was confiscated and where they're living at the time of the application. And then it may say where they were living at the time of the testimony as well. And that will give you a pretty good idea, of course, of where the slave owner might have been and where they were living. Is the surname of the claimant the same as the surname of the slave owner? That will tell you something, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit. Who were the witnesses to the signing of the initial application, and did they end up testifying? Often, usually, the initial application would be several years before the testimony. And so if they didn't testify, it could just be a falling out or they weren't available, but it could also mean that they had died. And so if the person you're looking for is one of those witnesses, that might tell you something significant. Did a witness testify in more than one claim? Again, if the person you're looking for is the witness, that might be useful to you. But also, if the person you're looking for is the claimant, if the witness testified in another case, which is very likely since they, were all living near each other, that they may say something in that other case that would be useful to you. Of course, who was the special commissioner and who was the lawyer? As we've already seen, that makes a big difference in how the testimony is going to look. Are people mentioned other than the claimant and the witness? They could mention anyone. They might give names of people who could prove their loyalty, of other people who were there that day. What I'm getting at is that, unfortunately, you really need to read all the case files for the county that you're interested in, because the person you're interested in might occur anywhere in the file. And then there's another type of information that can come out of these files, especially if you're looking at them on a holistic basis. Dr. Peggy Hargis, Associate Professor retired of Georgia Southern University, did quite a bit of research on the Southern Claims Commission process in Liberty County from a sociological standpoint, what it meant that people owned property, and she wrote a great article about it that I've linked in the handout. Well, all the claims give the former slave owner's name for the claimant and usually for the witnesses as well. You can imagine that having a list of all of those people with the names of the former slave owners beside them is really amazing genealogically. And it turns out that Dr. Hargis did this while she was doing her research. Here's a very bad copy of it. I found it at the Dorchester Academy African-American Museum, where she had provided a number of displays, and the list was one of them. So I contacted her, and she has been amazingly kind in passing along her research. But one of the things she did was give me permission to put that list into a sortable spreadsheet. And so it's on the website, you can sort it by surname, by enslaver's name, which is useful so you can see all the people that belong to a particular slave owner at the end of the war. But one interesting thing this has told us is people frequently wonder how common it was for a formerly enslaved person to take the surname of their last enslaver. Well, this is a list of 275 people in Liberty County, a small number, but large enough to draw some conclusions from, and only 10% of the people chose the name of the last slave owner, and it was mostly LeComptes, Quartermans, and Bacons for whatever reason. The ethical considerations in a community-focused project like this are many. For one, what right do I have as the descendant of a white descendant of a slave owner to air old dirty laundry? For example, there are some stories that I've left out of this presentation. The commissioners and the special agents' judgments were really harsh in some cases. Whether deserved or not, even though the transcript is available on the website, it's hard enough for a descendant to read those kinds of things without having them aired in a presentation like this. There's just no need for it. In one case, a prominent member of the African-American community acted as a private informant for the special agent, and his comments were kept in a special file. I don't see it as my place to talk about that. One, I don't know his motivations, and two, it was actually probably helpful that the commission had someone that they believed would give them both positive and negative information on a person. It probably helped some people get their cases approved. Ben Howard, as I've said, one of the witnesses for several of the claims, was lynched several decades after the Civil War. I've come across quite a bit of information for him as I've gone through court records especially, but I've not put it on the website. I've written up what I found, and I passed it to some descendants I heard of through a trusted intermediary. I never heard back, and I didn't expect to. My only concern about it is that there might be some descendants out there whose families left the area and don't have connections there who might want the information. But one of my purposes for having a website is so that descendants of enslaved people don't have to contact a white descendant of the enslaver like myself to get the information about their ancestors. So putting a note on the website to say, if you want to know more about Ben Howard, please contact me, doesn't really seem appropriate. I haven't got a good answer for that or for these other dilemmas. If any of you would like to offer an opinion in the comments, I would really welcome that, or even email me your thoughts on whether it's better just to put the information out there, or whether some of it maybe should be held back for private communication. Many of the ethical considerations apply to anyone doing this work, but of course, especially to a white descendant of slave owners. So the Southern Claims Commission case files can be a remarkable gift for genealogists and family historians. Still, to avoid misinterpretation, it's important to view them within the context of a particular place and time, and to thoroughly research all the details of the file. As we've seen, it's entirely possible to misunderstand what we're seeing if we only look at the individual case. If you saw one of the testimonies taken by Henry Way, you might get completely the wrong impression of your ancestor. So it's worthwhile to look at this from a community-focused approach. I would love to be contacted by anyone who's interested in Liberty County records. I try to make sure that as I process records, they're on the site right away so that people find them when they're looking. But I've learned a lot about how to research in Liberty County, and I'm happy to share that knowledge with anyone who's interested. Unfortunately, I really don't know much about other counties other than Liberty. Please don't hesitate to contact me. I'm going to be donating the fee for today's presentation to my favorite cause, the Susie King Taylor Underground Railroad Park, that is being planned by the Susie King Taylor Women's Institute and Ecology Center in Liberty County. Its executive director, Hermina Glasshill, moved to Liberty County from Atlanta to tell Susie King Taylor's story in her own hometown of Liberty County, Susie King Taylor's own hometown. And Hermina was influential in my starting the They Had Names website. Thank you for your time and attention, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of the conference.